In the 1st century, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder sat down to record a death. Not a war, not an emperor, a plant. It grew in only one place on earth, a thin strip of coastline near the Greek city of Cyrene, in what is now eastern Libya. For roughly 600 years it had been one of the most valuable crops in the entire Mediterranean. The Romans stockpiled it in the imperial treasury, beside the gold. The city that grew it stamped its image onto almost every coin it minted. People paid for it ounce for ounce against silver, and one of the things they were paying for was its reputation as the most reliable birth control the ancient world had ever known. By Pliny's day, it was nearly gone. He wrote that a single stalk had been found, and that it had been sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Nero, according to one account, simply ate it. The plant was called silphium, and its disappearance is the beginning of a much stranger story, about how much ancient people actually understood about controlling human fertility, how often they turned out to be right, and how completely that knowledge was buried afterward. It is easy to assume that herbal birth control was superstition. Crushed seeds and steeped roots and old recipes whispered between women, no more effective than a wish. For a long time, historians assumed exactly that. Then a scholar named John Riddle spent the better part of his career arguing the opposite. In 2 books, one tracing the ancient world to the Renaissance, the other carrying the thread up to the modern day, Riddle made a careful, heavily documented case that a great deal of this knowledge was real, that the plants did something, and that modern laboratories, when they finally got around to testing the old recipes, kept confirming them. So the question worth sitting with is not whether ancient people tried to control fertility. They obviously did, everywhere, constantly. The question is whether the things they reached for actually worked. And the answer, far more often than you would expect, is yes. Start in Egypt, because Egypt got there first. Around 1850, before the Common Era, a scribe wrote out a set of gynecological instructions on a sheet of papyrus, the document we now call the Kahun Papyrus. 3 centuries later, the famous Ebers Papyrus recorded more of the same. Among the recipes is a contraceptive pessary, a wad of soft material soaked in a paste and placed inside the body before sex. The active ingredients were honey, ground dates, and the gum of the acacia shrub. For a long time, that recipe read like folk nonsense. It is not. Acacia gum, left to ferment, breaks down into lactic acid. Lactic acid lowers the pH inside the vagina to a level that immobilizes sperm. It is a genuine spermicide, so genuine that lactic acid still turns up as an active ingredient in commercial contraceptive gels today. The honey thickened the mixture into a physical barrier and added mild antibacterial protection. The Egyptians were not guessing in the dark. They had assembled, by trial and observation, a 3-part system: barrier, chemical, and antimicrobial, that a modern pharmacist would recognize on sight. They could not have told you why it worked, but it worked. Not every Egyptian recipe holds up. One famous version called for crocodile dung, which sounds like proof that the whole tradition was nonsense. Even there, the logic is less absurd than it looks. The dung was mildly alkaline, and a thick pessary of anything forms a barrier. It was the wrong tool reached for the right reason. The point is that the hits were real hits. Grounded in chemistry the Egyptians had no way to name. Which brings the story back to silphium, the plant Rome loved to death. Silphium was a kind of giant fennel, a relative of the plant's botanists group under the genus Ferula. It grew wild and refused to be farmed. Every attempt to cultivate it outside that one coastal strip near Cyrene, pronounced Cyrene, failed. That scarcity is exactly what made the city rich, because demand never stopped. Greek physicians treated it as a cure-all. Roman cooks used it the way we use garlic. And quietly, persistently, women used it to avoid pregnancy, reportedly taking a dose about the size of a chickpea once a month. The plant's seed grew in a distinctive shape, a rounded form with a cleft at the top. Some have suggested that this little seed pod, printed on all those Cyrenian coins beside images of lovers, is where our familiar heart symbol comes from. That is a theory, not a fact, and a contested one. But it is a good measure of how deeply silphium was tangled up with sex and desire in the ancient imagination. Then it vanished. The reasons are still debated, It could not be cultivated, it was over-harvested, grazing animals stripped it, and the climate of the region was drying out. Some combination of those pressures finished it, and by the 1st century the imperial physician's miracle plant existed only as a memory and a coin. Here is the strange modern coda. A researcher in Turkey named Mahmut Miski has spent years studying a surviving Ferula species, Ferula drudeana, that grows in a remote pocket of central Anatolia. He believes it may be silphium itself, a survivor, not an extinction, and when his team analysed it, they found it loaded with active compounds, including ones with documented contraceptive and anti-inflammatory effects. The case is not closed, but the chemistry points in exactly the direction the ancients claimed. The people writing all this down were not fools, and it is worth meeting 2 of them. The first is Dioscorides, Dioscorides, a Greek physician of the 1st century whose pharmacology text, De Materia Medica, stayed in use for 1500 years. The second is Soranus of Ephesus, who wrote a treatise on gynecology in the 2nd century that reads, in places, startlingly like a clinical manual. Soranus did something that tells you how seriously this was taken. He drew a clear line between 2 categories of drug, the contraceptive, which prevents conception, and the abortifacient, which ends a pregnancy already begun. He had separate Greek words for each, and he kept them straight. This is not a man fumbling with charms. This is a physician sorting his pharmacy by mechanism. Among the things he recommended was pomegranate rind, and hold on to that one, because it comes back. Now to the plant that survived in living memory. Queen Anne's lace, the lacy white roadside flower that is botanically wild carrot, or Dorcas carota. Its seeds have been used to prevent pregnancy since at least the time of Hippocrates, and the use never fully died. Riddle documented women in the hollows of the Appalachian Mountains in the 20th century who still knew the recipe. Chew a spoonful of the seeds after sex. They could not have explained the biochemistry, they just knew it worked, and their grandmothers had known it too. When researchers finally tested wild carrot seed in the laboratory, they found a real effect. The seeds appear to interfere with progesterone, the hormone a body must produce to establish and hold a pregnancy. Block that signal in the critical early window, and implantation fails. In rodent studies, that is roughly what happened. A folk remedy passed hand to hand for 2,000 years turned out to be quietly pulling a hormonal lever that modern science only learned to name in the past century. Not every old remedy was kind, though, and honesty demands the dark example. Pennyroyal is a small plant in the mint family, and across the ancient and medieval world, it was a standard means of ending an early pregnancy. It contains a compound called pulegone, pronounced pu-lu-gon. And pulegone is in fact a powerful uterine stimulant, so the tradition was correct. Pennyroyal does what people said it did. It is also a violent poison. The same dose that acts on the uterus attacks the liver, and pennyroyal oil has killed people, not only in antiquity but in the modern era. Women who took it for exactly the historical reason and died of liver failure instead. This is the part of the story that resists any clean celebration. Ancient herbal fertility control was often effective. It was frequently dangerous. The line between the dose that worked and the dose that killed was thin, unmarked, and crossed in the dark, with no way to measure it. Being right is not the same as being safe. Now back to that pomegranate. Soranus prescribed pomegranate rind as a contraceptive, and for centuries that looked like another piece of doctrinal guesswork. Then it was tested. Fed to guinea pigs, pomegranate rind suppressed fertility. It carries estrogen-like compounds capable of disrupting the hormonal conditions a pregnancy depends on. The effect is real, demonstrated in animals, sitting right there in a fruit on the 2nd century prescription list. And there is an older echo if you want to read it. The Greek myth of Persephone turns on a pomegranate. Carried into the underworld, she eats a handful of its seeds, and that act binds her there, condemning the world to a long stretch of barren months each year when nothing grows. A goddess, a pomegranate, and a cycle of enforced barrenness. Some scholars read that as a fertility allegory hiding in plain sight, the cultural memory of a plant women actually used. That is interpretation, not proof. But it is hard to unsee once you have noticed it. So if so much of this knowledge was real, written down by physicians, tested in modern labs, carried in folk memory for thousands of years, the obvious question is the one Riddle built his second book around. Where did it go? The answer is not that it failed. Silphium went extinct, yes, and that single plant was genuinely lost. But the wider body of knowledge, the carrot seed, the pennyroyal, the pomegranate, the dosing, the timing, did not stop working. It was held, for most of history, as an oral tradition, and it was held largely by women, midwives, village healers, the mother who taught the daughter. It rarely lived in the official written male medical record, which is precisely why it was so easy to erase. As medicine professionalized in Europe, it became licensed, university-trained, and almost entirely male. The women who carried the old plant knowledge were pushed to the margins of healing, then out of it. At the same time, the Church increasingly treated contraception and abortion as grave sins, and the law followed. Riddle opens his account with a young woman hauled before the Inquisition in France in the year 1320, questioned about what she knew. During the witch trials, the very figure most likely to know which seeds did what, the wise woman, the herb wife, was exactly the kind of person who ended up accused. The knowledge did not announce its own death. It went underground and into disguise. Recipes that had plainly been contraceptives got rewritten as remedies to bring on a delayed period or to restore the menses, language vague enough to survive, vague enough to be deniable. Some of it limped on in those coded forms in scattered rural pockets. Much of it simply thinned out and disappeared, until by the modern era educated people could comfortably assume it had never really existed at all. That assumption was not a discovery. It was the shape of the whole left behind. And then, slowly, the labs caught up. In the 20th and 21st centuries, researchers with no particular interest in old manuscripts fed wild carrot seed to lab animals and watched implantation fail. They tested pomegranate rind and measured the drop in fertility. They pulled apart the chemistry of a surviving ferular relative and found anti-fertility compounds strong enough to work at tiny doses. One ingredient at a time, modern science confirmed prescriptions that a physician named Soranus had written down more than 1800 years earlier. The morning after pill works by manipulating the same hormonal pathway some of those herbs were quietly nudging all along. We tend to picture our ancestors as helpless against their own bodies, waiting for modern medicine to rescue them. The record says otherwise. They watched, they experimented, they kept notes, and they passed down what worked across thousands of years and dozens of cultures. They could not name a hormone or see a sperm cell. They were right anyway, not about everything, and not always safely, but far more often than we ever gave them credit for. The last stalk of silphium went to an emperor who ate it as a novelty, with no idea what he was holding. Most of the rest of that knowledge slipped away just as quietly, carried off by the women who kept it. We are still slowly finding pieces of it again and discovering each time that someone got there first. If you want to see more lost knowledge the modern world had to rediscover, click the video on screen now.